Virgin cared for a paralyzed millionaire for 10 years. Then one night she got an unexpected gift. The envelope was thick, expensive, and completely unexpected. Elena's hands trembled as she opened it in the dim light of her small apartment, still wearing her nurse's scrubs from another long day caring for James Whitmore. Inside was a single key and a note in James's shaky handwriting. 10 years ago, you gave me a reason to live. Tonight, I give you a reason to believe in miracles. Come to the house immediately, trust me. But when Elena arrived at the mansion 20 minutes later, she found James standing at the top of the stairs, standing on legs that hadn't worked in a decade, with tears streaming down his face as he took his first steps toward her. Before I reveal how this incredible moment came to be, I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. I love seeing our community span across the globe. And if you're already intrigued by this story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. 10 years earlier, Elena Martinez had answered a job posting that would change her life forever. Fresh out of nursing school, drowning in student loans, and still reeling from her mother's recent death, she'd applied for a private caregiver position without much hope. The salary was generous, suspiciously so, but the requirements were extensive: round-the-clock care for a paralyzed patient, residence on the property required, and absolute discretion. The interview had been unlike anything she'd expected. Instead of meeting with a hospital administrator or agency representative, she'd been driven to a sprawling estate outside the city. The house was beautiful, but felt empty, like a museum after closing time. She was led to a sunlit room where a man in his early 30s sat in a state-of-the-art wheelchair, his legs motionless beneath a cashmere blanket, his eyes holding a sadness that seemed to go deeper than his physical condition. "Miss Martinez," James Whitmore had said, his voice cultured but weary. "Tell me, why would a young woman with her whole life ahead of her want to spend it taking care of someone like me?" Eleanor had prepared diplomatic answers about career experience and helping others, but something in his eyes made her speak the truth. "Because I know what it's like to feel like your life is over," she'd said quietly. "My mother just died. She was everything to me. I became a nurse to save her, but I couldn't. Now I need to save someone, even if it's not her, even if it's a stranger. Maybe especially if it's a stranger." James had studied her for a long moment. "I was in a skiing accident 2 years ago," he'd said finally. "Severed my spinal cord. The doctors say I'll never walk again. I've been through 14 nurses in 24 months. They all leave. Either they pity me too much or not enough. They see the money and the house and think I should be grateful. Or they see the wheelchair and treat me like I'm already dead. Which are you, Miss Martinez?" "Neither," Elena had answered. "I see someone who's hurting. The money and the wheelchair are just circumstances. The hurt is what's real." She'd started the next day. The first months had been challenging. James was bitter, prone to dark moods and cutting remarks designed to push people away. He'd test her constantly, refusing medications, skipping physical therapy, making unreasonable demands at all hours. But Elena had grown up with a mother whose illness had taught her patience, and she met each challenge with quiet determination. "Why don't you quit?" James had asked one particularly bad night, after he'd thrown a glass against the wall in frustration. The others would have been gone by now. "Because you're not really angry at me," Elena had said, cleaning up the broken glass. "You're angry at your legs, at God, at the mountain, at yourself. I'm just here, and I'll keep being here until you're ready to be angry at the right things." Slowly, things had changed. Elena learned that James had been a brilliant tech entrepreneur, selling his first company at 25 and his second at 30. The accident had happened just weeks after his biggest success, turning triumph into tragedy. He'd pushed away friends, family, everyone who'd tried to help, convinced they only saw him as a burden or an obligation. But Elena was different. She didn't know the old James, the one who'd run marathons and climbed mountains. She only knew the man in the wheelchair, and she treated him with a matter-of-fact kindness that neither pitied nor patronized. She'd wheel him into the garden and read to him, not inspirational books about overcoming adversity, but mystery novels and science fiction, stories that took them both away from their circumstances. "You never talk about yourself," James had observed one afternoon, as Eleanor trimmed the roses that grew wild along the garden wall. "There's not much to tell," she'd replied. "I don't believe that. You mentioned your mother. Tell me about her." So Eleanor had. About growing up in a tiny apartment where love was abundant, even when money wasn't. About her mother's strength through years of illness. About the scholarship that had gotten her through nursing school and the dreams her mother had harbored for her. "She wanted me to travel," Eleanor had said softly, "see the world, fall in love, have adventures. Instead, she got sick and I spent my college years in hospitals." "Do you regret it?" "Never. Love isn't about grand adventures. It's about showing up every day, especially when it's hard." James had been quiet for a long time after that. As the years passed, their relationship evolved from patient and caregiver to something deeper. They developed routines that became rituals: morning coffee in the conservatory, afternoon physical therapy sessions where James pushed himself harder than his doctors recommended, evening chess games where they talked about everything and nothing. Elena discovered that beneath his bitterness, James had a brilliant mind that hadn't dimmed with his physical limitations. He started working again, adapting his home office for his wheelchair, taking video calls with investors and engineers. She'd sit quietly in the corner during these calls, watching him transform from the broken man she knew to the commanding presence he'd once been in boardrooms. "You're different when you work," she'd told him once. "That's who I used to be," he'd replied. "No," Eleanor had corrected gently. "That's who you still are. You just forgot for a while." The truth was they were healing each other. James gave Eleanor purpose when grief had left her adrift. Eleanor gave James hope when despair had convinced him life was over. Neither acknowledged the deeper feelings growing between them. It would have been inappropriate, complicated, impossible. But the staff noticed. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, would smile when she found them laughing over breakfast. Thomas, the groundskeeper, observed how James's eyes followed Elena when she walked through the garden. Dr. Patel, James's physician, commented on the remarkable improvement in his patient's mental and physical health. "Whatever you're doing," Dr. Patel had told Elena privately, "keep doing it. I've never seen him this engaged with his therapy." What Elena was doing was simple. She was seeing James as a whole person, not a broken one. She challenged him, argued with him, laughed with him. She never let him wallow in self-pity, but she also never dismissed his pain. She was simply, consistently, unwaveringly there. 5 years into their arrangement, something shifted. James had been working with a new specialist, someone who dealt with experimental spinal cord treatments. He'd kept the appointment secret, not wanting to raise false hopes, his own or anyone else's. But Eleanor had noticed the changes in his routine, the new medications, the increased physical therapy sessions. "You're pushing too hard," she'd warned one evening, finding him exhausted after a particularly grueling session. "Maybe that's what I need to do," he'd replied cryptically. Around the same time, Elena had started receiving mysterious gifts. A first edition of her favorite novel appeared on her bedside table. A silk scarf in her mother's favorite color was draped over her chair. A passport, which she'd never owned, arrived with a note saying simply, "For someday." "James," she'd confronted him, "you have to stop buying me things." "I have no idea what you're talking about," he'd said, but his eyes had sparkled with mischief she hadn't seen before. The gifts continued, each more thoughtful than the last. Not expensive for the sake of expense, but meaningful in ways that showed how carefully he paid attention to her. A pressed flower from her mother's favorite plant, a photograph of the Italian village her grandmother had come from, a music box that played the lullaby her mother used to hum. 7 years in, the lines between professional and personal had blurred beyond recognition. Eleanor still maintained her professional duties, but she was also James's closest friend, his confidant, his anchor. They'd developed a language of small gestures and unspoken understanding. She knew when he needed space and when he needed company. He knew when memories of her mother were weighing on her and would distract her with terrible jokes or complicated chess strategies. "Do you ever think about leaving?" James asked one winter evening as snow fell outside the conservatory windows. "Where would I go?" Eleanor had responded, but they both knew that wasn't really an answer. "You're young. You should be out living your life, not stuck here with me." "I am living my life," Eleanor had said firmly. "This is my choice, James. Every day I choose to be here, not because I have to, but because I want to." "Why?" The question was barely a whisper. Eleanor had looked at him for a long moment, weighing her words. "Because somewhere along the way, taking care of you stopped being a job and started being home." The air between them had crackled with unspoken truths, but neither had been brave enough to voice them. Year 8 brought changes. James's experimental treatments were showing unprecedented results. Sensation was returning to his legs, not enough for movement but enough for hope. He threw himself into therapy with renewed determination, often pushing so hard that Eleanor had to physically intervene. "You're going to hurt yourself," she'd scold, finding him attempting exercises beyond his current capabilities. "Maybe that's a risk worth taking," he'd reply. Eleanor didn't know about the late-night video calls with specialists in Switzerland, the experimental procedures being developed, the astronomical costs James was willing to pay for even a chance at recovery. She didn't know that every painful therapy session was driven by a dream he'd never dared voice, the dream of standing up, walking to her, and telling her truths that couldn't be spoken from a wheelchair. Year 9 was when everything began to accelerate. James's progress astounded his medical team. Muscle movement returned incrementally, a toe wiggle that made Elena cry, a knee bend that had them both laughing with joy. But James insisted on keeping the full extent of his recovery quiet. "I don't want to jinx it," he'd told Dr. Patel, "and I need to be sure." What he didn't say was that he was planning something. The gifts to Elena became more frequent, more meaningful. He'd started a project in secret, working with architects and contractors during the hours when Elena was off duty. He'd had his lawyers draw up documents, make arrangements, prepare for a moment he'd been imagining for years. "You're up to something," Elena had accused playfully one morning, catching him hiding blueprints. "Always," he'd agreed, but his smile had been tender rather than mischievous. The night before their 10-year anniversary, though neither had ever acknowledged they were counting, James had done something unprecedented. He'd given Elena the evening off, insisting she go home to her apartment for the night. "I have an early medical appointment," he'd lied. "No need for you to be here at dawn." Eleanor had been suspicious but complied, which is why she'd been alone in her apartment when the envelope arrived by special courier at exactly 10 p.m., 10 years to the hour from when she'd first walked into James Whitmore's life. The note inside had been brief but urgent. "10 years ago, you gave me a reason to live. Tonight, I give you a reason to believe in miracles. Come to the house immediately. Trust me." Elena had driven through the night with her heart pounding, 1,000 scenarios racing through her mind. Was James ill? Had something happened? The house had been ablaze with lights when she'd arrived, every window glowing against the darkness. She'd used her key to enter, calling out for James, but the first floor had been empty. Then she'd heard his voice from upstairs, where he never went, where the wheelchair couldn't go. "Eleanor," he'd called, "I'm in the ballroom." The ballroom. A relic from the house's grander days, it had been closed off since James's accident. Eleanor had climbed the stairs with trembling legs, her mind unable to process what she was hearing. And when she'd pushed open the massive double doors, she'd seen him. James Whitmore was standing. Not just standing, he was wearing a tuxedo, his hands gripping a walker for support, but undeniably, miraculously on his feet. The room behind him had been transformed. Thousands of fairy lights created a canopy of stars. Photographs covered every surface. 10 years of moments Elena hadn't even known were being captured. The two of them in the garden, playing chess, reading in the conservatory, living a life together. "James," Elena breathed, unable to move. "How?" 2 years of secret treatments, he said, his voice shaking with emotion and effort. Experimental procedures in Switzerland. Stem cell therapy, neural implants, things that aren't even approved yet. My doctor said I was crazy. Maybe I was, but I had to try. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to be sure, and because... He took a shaky step forward, then another. Each movement was clearly difficult, painful even, but he kept coming. Because I needed to do this. To walk to you, not have you come to me. To stand when I tell you what I should have said years ago. Elena was crying now, tears streaming down her face as James slowly crossed the room. When he finally reached her, he let go of the walker with one hand to touch her face. "Elena Martinez," he said softly, "you saved my life. Not the doctors, not the surgeries. You. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. You stayed when everyone else left. You made me want to fight, to hope, to dream of impossible things. Like standing again, like this moment." "James," Elena whispered, but he wasn't finished. "I fell in love with you somewhere between that first broken glass and the 1000th chess game. But I couldn't tell you. Not when you were my employee. Not when I was trapped in that chair. Not when I had nothing to offer but a broken body and a bitter heart." He swayed slightly, and Elena instinctively reached out to steady him, her hands finding his arms, solid and strong. "But now," James continued, "now I can stand before you as a man who's learned to walk again, literally and figuratively. I can offer you more than just a job or a patient to care for. I can offer you a partner, a future, adventures your mother dreamed of for you, if you'll have me." Elena was laughing and crying simultaneously. "You impossible, infuriating, wonderful man, don't you know? I fell in love with you exactly as you were. The wheelchair never mattered, your legs never mattered, just you." "Then marry me," James said simply. "Not because I can walk again, but because I can't imagine walking anywhere without you beside me. Marry me because 10 years is long enough to pretend we're just patient and caregiver. Marry me because—" Elena silenced him with a kiss, pouring 10 years of unspoken feelings into the moment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, she smiled. "Yes," she said, "but on one condition. Anything. We keep the wheelchair. You're going to need it after all this standing, and I've gotten very good at pushing it." James laughed, the sound rich and full of joy. "Deal, though I should mention, this isn't your only anniversary gift." "James, no. This is enough, more than enough." Too late. He gestured to a table Elena hadn't noticed, covered in documents. "Remember that project I've been working on? I've established a spinal cord research foundation, the Elena Martinez Foundation, specifically, fully funded for the next century, to help other people get their miracles too." Eleanor stared at him in shock. "You named it after me? Who else? You're the miracle worker here. I just learned to walk. You taught me to live." They stood there in the transformed ballroom, holding each other, two people who'd found love in the most unexpected circumstances. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the world in white, making everything new. "There's one more thing," James said eventually. "In the drawer of that table, your mother's dream for you." Eleanor found an envelope containing 2 first-class tickets to Italy, dated for the following month. "Our honeymoon," James explained. "If you'll have me. We'll see that village your grandmother came from. Have those adventures. Make new dreams to replace the old ones. What about your treatments, your therapy?" "I'll need help," James admitted. "Probably for the rest of my life. Good thing I know an excellent nurse who makes house calls." Eleanor laughed, wrapping her arms around him again. "The best thing that ever happened to me was answering that job posting," she said. "I thought I was saving you, but you saved me right back." "We saved each other," James corrected. "That's what love does." They swayed together, slowly, carefully, James's legs trembling with the effort, but holding strong. 10 years of patience, pain, and perseverance had led to this moment. Not just the miracle of James walking again, but the miracle of 2 broken people making each other whole. "I should warn you," Elena said against his shoulder. "I'm a terrible traveler. I've never been on a plane." "I should warn you," James replied. "I'm probably going to need that wheelchair at the airport. These legs are mostly for show right now." "Then we'll take turns," Elena said. "You'll walk when you can, I'll push when you can't, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." That sounds like a perfect plan for a marriage. As if on cue, James's legs gave out. Elena caught him smoothly, a decade of experience making the motion automatic, and helped him to a chair that had been strategically placed nearby. Neither of them saw it as a failure. It was simply their reality, and they'd learned to navigate it together. The staff knew, didn't they? Elena asked suddenly. About your recovery, about tonight? James grinned. Mrs. Chen has been cooking your favorite foods all week. Thomas spent 3 days stringing these lights. Dr. Patel almost spoiled it twice. They all love you, you know. Almost as much as I do. Impossible, Elena said, kissing him again. No one could love anyone that much. They spent the rest of the night in the ballroom, James in his chair now, but neither of them caring. They talked about the future, the trips they'd take, the work they'd do with the foundation, the life they'd build together. Eleanor called her aunt in California, waking her up to share the news, laughing as James tried to explain how he'd been secretly learning to walk again for 2 years. I have a confession, Eleanor said, as dawn broke through the ballroom windows. I knew you were the one buying me all those gifts. Of course you did, I'm not that subtle. No, but you were thoughtful. Every gift told me you were paying attention, that you saw me, really saw me. That's when I knew I loved you. When did you know I loved you? James asked. The day you threw that glass at the wall, and then apologized by trying to clean it up yourself. You cut your hand, remember? And you were more worried about me being upset than about the blood. You kept saying you didn't mean to make more work for me. That's when I knew your anger was really fear, and your fear was really love. That was our first year, James said wonderingly. You knew for 9 years and never said anything? You weren't ready, neither was I. We both had healing to do first. And now? Now we're exactly where we're supposed to be. The wedding took place 3 months later in the conservatory, surrounded by the roses Elena had tended for a decade. James stood for the ceremony, his determination to walk down the aisle matching Elena's years earlier when she'd walked into his life. The guest list was small but meaningful. The staff who'd become family, a few distant relatives James had reconnected with, Eleanor's aunt who flew in from California, and several patients from the Spinal Cord Foundation who'd already begun benefiting from the research programs. Madison, the little girl who'd asked about marriage in the kindergarten classroom, would have loved the flowers. Dr. Patel served as James's best man, joking that he'd never had a patient work so hard to put him out of a job. Mrs. Chen cried through the entire ceremony, while Thomas made sure every rose was perfect. Elena wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, but carrying the love of generations. James wore a custom tuxedo that accommodated the leg braces he still needed for extended standing. They'd written their own vows, each a reflection of their journey. Elena, James said, his voice strong despite the effort of standing, you taught me that love isn't about being whole. It's about being willing to heal. You showed me that strength isn't about what your body can do, but what your heart can endure. You gave me 10 years of patience when I gave you 10 years of pain. I promise to spend the rest of my life earning the gift of your love, whether I'm standing, sitting, or crawling. You are my miracle, and I am forever yours. Elena's vows were equally moving. James, you showed me that caring for someone isn't a burden. It's a privilege. You taught me that love grows not in spite of challenges, but because of how we face them together. You gave me purpose when I was lost, hope when I was grieving, and a home when I needed one most. I promise to stand by you, literally and figuratively, through whatever comes. You are my adventure, my peace, and my greatest joy. When they kissed, the small gathering erupted in cheers. James managed to walk back down the aisle with Eleanor, each step a victory, each moment a celebration of how far they'd come. Their honeymoon to Italy was everything Eleanor's mother had dreamed of and more. They navigated ancient cobblestones with a combination of James's cane, Eleanor's steady arm, and occasionally the travel wheelchair they'd brought along. They found the village Eleanor's grandmother had left decades ago, met distant cousins who welcomed them with tears and wine, and stood together in a small church where generations of Elena's family had been married. Your mother would be so proud, James said one evening, as they watched the sunset from their hotel balcony. She would have loved you, Elena replied. She always told me that the best love stories are the ones that don't make sense on paper, but make perfect sense in person. A paralyzed billionaire and his nurse. That definitely doesn't make sense on paper. A man who needed to learn to hope and a woman who needed to learn to heal. That makes perfect sense to me. They traveled for a month, James's legs growing stronger with each day of walking through museums and markets. But they also learned to accept limitations, to rest when needed, to let love be enough when perfection wasn't possible. Back home, they threw themselves into the Foundation's work. Elena took point on patient advocacy, using her nursing experience to ensure that research translated into real help for real people. James leveraged his business connections to fund cutting-edge research, turning his personal miracle into possibility for others. The first patient to walk again through their Foundation's sponsored treatment was a young mother named Sarah. When she took her first steps, Elena and James were there, both crying as they remembered their own moment in the ballroom. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, gripping Elena's hands. "Thank you for giving me hope." "Thank hope," Elena replied, glancing at James. "It's stronger than any medicine." 5 years into their marriage, the Foundation had helped dozens of patients regain mobility. Not all could walk again. Spinal injuries were complex and individual, but each found improved quality of life, whether through partial recovery, better pain management, or adaptive technologies James's team developed. Eleanor had also returned to school, earning advanced degrees in rehabilitation therapy and patient advocacy. She joked that she was finally using James's money for something selfish, her education, but he pointed out that every class she took translated into better care for their patients. "You can't help yourself," he'd tease. "Even your selfishness is actually selfless." Their home had changed too. The mansion that had once felt like a beautiful prison now hummed with life. They hosted regular dinners for patients and families, turned unused rooms into temporary housing for people traveling for treatment, and filled the gardens with accessible paths so everyone could enjoy the roses. "Remember when you first came here?" James asked one evening as they sat in the conservatory, his hand intertwined with hers. "You said the house felt empty." "It was empty," Elena replied. "Empty of hope, of purpose, of love. Now look at it." Through the windows they could see children playing, patients' kids who came for the Foundation's family programs. The sound of laughter drifted through the glass, mixing with the evening birdsong. "We did this," James said wonderingly. "We took our pain and turned it into this." "No," Eleanor corrected gently. "Love did this. We just got out of its way." 10 years after their wedding, 20 years after that first fateful meeting, they stood in the same ballroom where James had proposed. This time it was filled with hundreds of people, patients, families, medical professionals, and supporters of the Elena Martinez Foundation. James walked to the podium unassisted, his gait steady if not quite smooth. The years had brought challenges, setbacks in his recovery, days when the pain was too much, nights when Elena had to remind him that healing wasn't linear. But they'd faced each challenge together. 20 years ago, James began his speech, a young woman answered my job posting. I thought I was hiring a nurse. Instead, I found my salvation. Elena taught me that miracles aren't just about walking again. They're about finding someone who sees you at your worst and chooses to stay. They're about learning that love isn't a feeling. It's a practice, a choice we make every day. He paused, finding Eleanor's eyes in the crowd. She was standing near a group of patients, her hand on the shoulder of a teenager who'd just started treatment. This foundation exists because Elena Martinez believed in impossible things. She believed a bitter, broken man could learn to hope again. She believed that care could become love. She believed that miracles were worth working for, even when the work was hard and the miracles seemed impossible. Every person who's been helped by our work, every step taken, every life improved, it all started with a young nurse who answered an ad and changed my world. The room erupted in applause, but Elena was already making her way to the stage. James met her halfway, and they stood together, two people who'd found everything by refusing to give up on each other. "I have something to tell you," Elena whispered as the applause continued. "Now," in front of everyone. Especially now. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. We're going to need to baby-proof the house and maybe look into adaptive equipment for parents with mobility challenges. James's eyes widened. At 52, after years of being told that his injuries might affect fertility, after Eleanor had insisted she didn't need children when she had him and their work, this was another miracle neither had dared hope for. Are you sure? 3 tests, sure. Dr. Patel confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to wait for tonight to tell you here where everything started. James pulled her into his arms, not caring that hundreds of people were watching, not caring that tears were streaming down his face. How do you keep doing this? Keep giving me reasons to believe in impossible things? I learned from the best, Elena replied. A man who refused to accept that paralysis was the end of his story, who worked for years in secret just to stand up and propose, who turned his pain into purpose and his purpose into love. They stood there holding each other as their guests gradually realized something momentous was happening. The applause started again, even though most didn't know what they were celebrating. It didn't matter. Joy was contagious and the room was full of people who understood that every good moment was worth celebrating. Their daughter was born on a snowy December morning, arriving with her mother's dark hair and her father's determined spirit. They named her Hope because that's what she represented, hope for the future, hope for continued miracles, hope that love could overcome any obstacle. She's perfect, James whispered, holding his daughter for the first time, his hands steady despite the emotion overwhelming him. Of course she is, Elena replied from her hospital bed. She's already beaten the odds just by being here. Hope grew up in a house full of love and purpose. She learned to walk in the same hallways where her father had relearned, took her first steps in the conservatory where her parents had fallen in love over chess and conversations. She understood from an early age that legs worked differently for different people, that love looked like patience, and that miracles were just stubborn hope in action. Tell me the story, Hope would demand at bedtime, never tiring of hearing how her parents met. Once upon a time, Elena would begin, I answered a job ad, and Daddy was grumpy, Hope would interject, giggling. Very grumpy, James would agree, rolling into her room in the wheelchair he still used on long days. But your mother was patient and brave. The bravest, Elena would confirm. And slowly, we helped each other heal. And then Daddy learned to walk again. That's right. But the walking wasn't the most important part. What was? Hope would ask, though she knew the answer. Learning to love, both parents would say together. As Hope grew, so did the foundation. What had started as one couple's attempt to pay forward their miracle had become a global movement. Research centers bore Elena's name. Treatment protocols James had funded became standard care. Thousands of people who'd been told they'd never walk again were taking steps, and millions more were living better lives thanks to advances in spinal cord treatment. But for Elena and James, the greatest success was smaller, quieter. It was mornings in the conservatory, now with Hope reading to them. It was the way James's hand still found Elena's after all these years. It was the laughter that filled their home, the patients who became friends, the love that had transformed a job interview into a life together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't answered that ad? James asked one evening, as they watched Hope play in the garden, her laughter mixing with the evening birdsong. Never, Eleanor replied without hesitation. This was always where I was meant to be, with you, building this life, creating these miracles. Even the hard parts, the years when I couldn't walk, the pain, the surgeries, the setbacks, especially those parts. They made us who we are. They gave us empathy for others struggling. They taught us that love isn't about perfect circumstances. It's about imperfect people choosing each other perfectly. James pulled her close, marveling, as he always did, that this remarkable woman had chosen him, had stayed with him, had built a life and a legacy with him. I love you, he said, the words as true as they'd been 20 years ago, but deeper now, seasoned by time and trials and triumphs. I love you too, Elena replied. Thank you for letting me answer that ad. Thank you for being brave enough to stay. As the sun set over their garden, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the Whitmore family sat together in the conservatory. Hope was teaching her dolls to play chess, using the same board where her parents had fallen in love. Eleanor was reading patient files, always looking for ways to help more people. James was sketching plans for a new wing of the foundation, his hands steady and sure. They were living proof that love could transform tragedy into triumph, that miracles weren't just about physical healing, but emotional resurrection, and that sometimes the best gifts come not in the form of grand gestures, but in the quiet dedication of showing up every day for someone who needs you. 25 years after a young nurse had answered an ad to care for a paralyzed millionaire, their story continued to ripple outward, touching lives, inspiring hope, and proving that the most unexpected gifts often come disguised as challenges. Elena had thought she was taking a job. James had thought he was hiring help. Instead, they'd found everything: love, purpose, family, and a future neither had dared imagine. And in the conservatory where it all began, surrounded by roses and laughter, and the quiet miracle of an ordinary evening made extraordinary by love, they were home. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey of love, dedication, and the miracles that can happen when we open our hearts to unexpected possibilities. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a love that transformed lives? Share your story in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places, and love has the power to heal in ways medicine never could. Until next time, keep believing in miracles, in second chances, and in the transformative power of unconditional love.